Good morning, Vietnam. Good morning, everybody from Southern California. This is Dr. Anthony Chang. I'm the founder of AI Med and been really excited to bring you this webinar today. And we have some exciting speakers representing two organizations and companies that I think have really spearheaded the AI movement in terms of implementation. So before we get to our speakers, I just want to welcome everybody. And this is a series of AI Med webinars. And I'd like to briefly go over the learning objectives. We are going to describe to you the AI health market, and just based on my last few talks, it's really been more interest and more excitement about AI in healthcare than ever before, particularly about just how to implement it. We'd like to talk about AI strategy that will align to the organizational goals, because that's a key part of implementation. Our speakers will also describe the key components to a lasting AI strategy, and the key word there is lasting. We want this to be implemented and maintained in the organization. And lastly, we will talk about the steps of actually operationalizing the AI strategy effectively. We have two fantastic speakers this morning. Very lucky to get both. One is Dr. John Frownfelter, who is the CMIO for Jvion. And as most of you know, Jvion's been really a company that's out in front in terms of getting AI implemented in the healthcare organization. And he's going to talk about, based on his years of experience and dealing with health systems and the care transformation, talk about how to implement your AI strategy. And we're also very lucky to have Molly McCarthy, who is an RN MBA, who is the National Director and the Chief Nursing Officer in the Health and Life Sciences sector for Microsoft. And Molly's been in this business for more than 25 years, and like John, very passionate about implementing technology to affect patient outcome and quality of care. So our brief agenda is we'll have everyone brought up to speed on understanding where we are in the healthcare AI market today. As I said, it's on the ascending limb of the cycle. We'll help to define the AI strategy and also talk about the key components of a successful AI strategy, and then as well as operationalizing the AI strategy. So I think these are all very important steps in actually bringing AI to your organization. And I just want to remind the attendees that they can submit questions through the chat option on the StreamGo, and that's on your right-hand side. And then questions will be answered at the end of the session for about 10 minutes if we have time. So now I'm just going to let Molly go through a couple of polling questions. Molly?
Great. Thanks, Dr. Chang. It's great to be with you, everyone here today. I'm excited to talk to you about AI and what we're seeing in the marketplace today. But before we get started, I just had a couple of questions. John and I wanted to know if you take a look at the poll, we always like to know who our audience is. And so we're wondering if you could tell us which of the following best describes the field in which you work. So go ahead. I'll give you guys a couple seconds to submit that poll, and then we'll take a look at the results. Again, it's on the right-hand side of your screen. And I'll give you about 5 more seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. So if you're still trying to determine which of the following best describes the field in which you work, go ahead and submit it now. And it looks like you can see I believe you can see the percentages of where the audience is from. It looks like a majority from consulting firms, and secondly from academic institutions. So we've got actually a nice cross-section too as well from payer and life sciences. So great, thank you guys so much. We've got one more question before we get started. The second poll is really, what is your current interest in AI? And I'm going to go ahead and publish that poll and give you a few seconds to do that. And again, if you can just click your submission on the right-hand side, that would be great. About 5 more seconds. I'm sure that your interest might change after we speak today, hopefully, just to get a better feel for where we are. We're just seeing a tremendous uptick. I was talking with someone the other day how I feel like a few years ago when we were with cloud technology and healthcare, in terms of adoption, was very low compared to where we are today. I feel like we're at the same place we were with cloud in terms of AI. So I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. And we'll take a look. It looks like I'm currently working to build an AI solution within my organization as first. I'm gathering information on AI and its potential value for my organization as second. So great. And then we have a group also just looking to understand its application in healthcare. So I'm going to display those results. Can you see them, everybody? Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started. John and I are going to hopefully enlighten you today a little bit more about AI and from his perspective and what I've been seeing in the provider industry. I also work with some payer and life science organizations. And in fact, I was just last week at the National Academy of Medicine meeting, the Future of Nursing for 2020 through 2030, and a lot of the topics in that meeting were around the changing healthcare market, the impact that AI will have in healthcare, and actually how that will change the role of nurses and physicians and those in hospitals caring for patients, and actually outside of hospitals caring for patients. So it's a hot topic. 3 different areas that when I think about the AI market, I think about what I call a CFO, which is here is clinical, operational, and financial. And I'm just going to give you an example of each just to make it real and hopefully you can relate to it within your particular area. So under clinical, and that's probably the area that clinical and operational that I work most closely with. Some examples there really are predicting disease, hotspots at a population level, for example, where there might be a flu outbreak, for example. The second one really is around preventing adverse events. And I think about this, and I think about time that I worked in the hospital. I actually worked in pediatrics and NICU, and thinking about ways that we could potentially prevent patient deterioration, for example, a cardiac arrest or respiratory arrest out on the floor. How could we get information sooner so that we could avoid that and potentially transfer them to the ICU? In terms of operational, really thinking about workflow within a hospital and thinking about the everyday things that clinicians do and how can we potentially automate clinician burden through documentation, for example. How can we implement AI there so it's a seamless process? The second one that I've been working on is really thinking about improving staffing efficiency. So can we predict gaps and surpluses in advance? And this has been a long time, to some extent, a game within healthcare, but really thinking about nurse staffing, for example. How can we potentially use AI to better staff the emergency department throughout the week, throughout the year, that will potentially increase patient experience and satisfaction, as well as potentially decrease wait time. So that's just another example of an operational application. And finally, financial applications. Obviously, we're in an incredibly tight market today in terms of margins, et cetera, with hospitals. And I think ultimately we're really looking to achieve that quadruple aim. That is, how can we lower the cost of the care that we're providing? How can we provide those better outcomes? And quite frankly, at the end of the day, as a provider or a clinic, how can we achieve reimbursement? So I want to tell you a little bit before I hand it off to John about what is actually going on in the government sector. And I think there are three different areas that I wanted to touch on. One is CMS, the second one is FDA, and then the last one is the Jason report that was published in December of 2017. So first of all, with CMS, they really want to garner feedback and input from the market, really across all types of sectors, so that are all represented here today. And they're looking for essentially submissions for a challenge around AI. And it's called the Artificial Intelligence Health Outcomes Challenge. And so again, looking to see how we can use AI to better predict health outcomes, and really ties back to that quadruple aim that I mentioned before. The second effort that's ongoing is within the FDA. And obviously, I think we're all pretty familiar with the FDA, and they essentially would like to look to monitor and regulate innovative clinical decision support and patient-facing technologies, specifically those that leverage AI and machine learning to support decision-making. And then finally, the last component that is influencing the marketplace today is a study that was commissioned by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services with support from AHRQ and RWJF. And they essentially asked this group to look at how AI is beginning to play a growing role in transforming healthcare. And it's a 69-page report. In case you want to go out and take a look, it's publicly available on healthit.gov. And basically, they were looking to address many of the challenges that we're seeing in this field. For example, the acceptance of AI applications in clinical practice, executing large-scale data collection to include missing data streams. So I think this report really started to address how can we better capitalize on this technology and integrate it within healthcare. I don't know, John, if you had anything to add so far. I didn't want to exclude you.
No, there's certainly the government's getting involved in creating some structure and processes for bringing the value of AI. And I think we'll get into the provider side of this as we continue through the talk, but the government's certainly moving, creating the framework for us to work within. So it'll be important to keep an eye on it.
Great. Thanks. So this next slide, I think when I look at this, I think of before and after. So obviously, what is going on with these four different areas, for example, clinical workflow before AI, and I talked a little bit about that when I mentioned staffing, but how can we implement a technology, and from my perspective as a clinician, really in the background of what's going on in, for example, in emergency department, so that so that we're working more efficiently and really redirecting our efforts towards that clinical care. And you can see here that with this particular example, when we did implement AI, and John can touch on this a little bit more, there was a 27 to 75% decrease in resource demand. So you're getting the right care to the right patient really at the right time. And John, I don't know if you have anything to add from your perspective that you've seen on disease risk or workflow or any of the other categories. I welcome your input.
Yeah, thanks. So the resource utilization is a really tricky one because the CFO will say, well, I'm not cutting FTEs, so there's no net decrease in resources. But what we often see is a repurposing and a focusing of the resources of people that are doing the work they're doing today, and when AI is applied, then it shifts their work to something different or with sharper focus. And so that those numbers will depend upon the degree in which you automate a process versus keeping it manual. So there's a lot of variables that go into, and that's why the range is so wide. You know, it's almost saying, well, anything's possible when you have a range that wide, but it really depends upon how it's implemented.
Great, thank you. When I first saw this slide, quite frankly, when we were talking about this slide and why strategies fail, and it's not just necessarily AI strategies or IT strategies, but a lot of what I've seen in healthcare over the past 25 years and what I've been involved with is sure these three different areas in terms of translation, sustain, and adaptation, but also I think one of the biggest reasons for failure, I think, is truly involving the key stakeholders in that strategy from the get-go. And I say that thinking about, for example, the clinicians, the physicians and the nurses who are at the bedside, who are at the forefront of care, and really truly understanding their workflow and how we can essentially integrate, as I mentioned before, AI and machine learning into that workflow. And they're truly some of the best folks to help develop those solutions because they understand the pitfalls of, and they're the ones creating the workarounds in the marketplace. So I think including clinicians in the design and development of solutions is critical. I also think about kind of on a more global level, you know, the pace at which technology is changing is just incredibly fast. I'm at a big technology company. I work with healthcare organizations. Obviously, healthcare organizations, you know, I talked with one CMIO who's down in El Paso, Texas, and he said, you know, I need to bank on this technology working and being around in the next 2 years before I invest time and money and any type of proof of concept. And John, from your perspective at Jvion, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what you've seen in the marketplace, what's been successful, and maybe what's not been so successful.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. We forget sometimes that healthcare has become so complicated. The core competency of a health system is to deliver and provide healthcare. And when we start to look at things like electronic records and technology, we slip into the space of do we build versus do we buy it? And it makes sense at times to build something. There's a real appetite or interest right now in building out analytic solutions, but I think those are the same pitfalls that we saw 15, 20 years ago of building out an electronic health record, and then with the passage of the high-tech legislation, pretty much everything homegrown was done away with, and we went with vendor solutions. I don't see it coming with AI, but what I do see is vastly underestimating the work effort and the complexity of building an AI solution. So that's, to me, one of the things that I've seen in even some of our customers is they start with this ambition to build, and then they end up buying. The second thought I have around this is the approach to AI is important to think about. When we think that's going to solve everything and it's going to replace our thinking, that's a short path to disaster. It starts at least in the area of clinical analytics, clinical prescriptive analytics. It starts more as a nudge and as a suggestion. If we think of it like another lab test that a physician or a nurse will use to interpret what they're seeing and make decisions that just change the direction a little bit of what they're doing or the patient. In the clinical prescriptive arena, that's the role of AI today. So not to assume that it's going to solve every clinical challenge that we're facing is important. So those are a couple of thoughts around the opportunities and also the risks of failure.
Right. And so you said you've seen a bigger propensity to buying. Is that what I heard? As opposed to building?
Yeah, I see both. What I see being successful is more buying a solution with a defined objective. When there's an attempt to build, there's even some very large academic institutions with very robust data science teams, like the folks with over 100 data scientists.
Right.
The perception that they want to create, even internally in the analytics team, is that they can do everything. The reality is most of the time they can't. So then there's a gap between what's being promised and what's being delivered, and the clinical community gets frustrated. And if anybody's been in that space in a health system, you felt that frustration. Yeah, they promise a lot, but they don't deliver much. We've heard this again and again. So creating some boundaries and focus for who does what is very important.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've worked with a lot of different providers who, in even creating that one-off solution and really understanding how they can scale it across the organization, sometimes it fails short. So those are great points that you bring up. Couple other things I wanted to touch on. One is, we've been talking about this, is thinking about, okay, how do you actually sit down and define an AI strategy as your broader strategy within IT, within digital health, et cetera, and then how does that actually carry out into fruition? And I think first of all, one is, this goes without saying, I think leadership is key, and thinking about basically shifting from managing milestones to managing outcomes. And that's so critical as we move towards value-based care, really changing that mindset. The second one is the flexibility and the ability to adapt to change. And this is obviously much easier said than done. I think, as I mentioned, technology is changing so rapidly over the past, I've been at Microsoft for 6 years, and when I came to Microsoft, hardly any healthcare organizations were utilizing cloud. That's changed. AI is now being implemented across organizations. And I think that these changes that are happening so rapidly, we need to keep in mind that we need to be able to adapt our strategy based upon feedback, based upon outcomes. I also think that getting those champions within the system, and that maybe that goes back to leadership a little bit. The third piece really is capability building, and thinking about how do we help our individuals within the organization develop new skills and competencies that are needed to achieve this strategy. And actually just last week, Microsoft launched an AI school. So just putting it out there for individuals looking to take that next step. I think with I've worked a lot with the clinical community, nurses and physicians, and sometimes it can be daunting and quite frankly overwhelming, but I think diving in and really taking a deeper look and getting comfortable with it, excuse me, is so important because it's here and it's really changing the way that we're going to work, and it's going to, as I mentioned earlier, it's changing what our roles will potentially be in the workforce. And the final piece is just thinking about how we can, as I mentioned before, continuously evaluate what actions we're taking, the impact the technology has, and then also I think what goes hand in hand with this is just as we implement a technology and you make those expectations known to your clinicians as well as your consumers and your patients, not just doing necessarily a proof of concept, but when you're introducing, have a plan for sustaining the program. So whatever benefit that you're bringing to them, that can sustain over time. I've seen that in the past with some telemedicine strategies, but I think that really making that longer term plan, both from a cost and revenue perspective, is key. And then, John, I wanted to turn it back over to you to see if you had any additional talking points here that you want to share with the group.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, there's so much. This is just it's a topic that we're both energized with, so we could go for 3 hours if everybody else had that in their schedule. So, a couple of points here. One, it definitely is an iterative approach, and I like what you referenced to telemedicine. These strategies don't lift off with a one-time planning, architecting it, and then you implement and you move on. It is iterative, and that's very important. I want to just touch on too that flexibility and that ability to adapt to change. The cultural requirement for assimilating AI into healthcare and with providers in particular requires that flexibility. Artificial intelligence, it's both disruptive and it's also threatening to the very people who would probably need to use it or who will be using it. So how do we adapt? How do we adapt to that shift? And especially physicians and nurses, we're taught and trained that anything you can't, see, touch, or feel, or really understand and get your hands on, then we almost reject it. And artificial intelligence is the opposite of that. It is unknown. What we can see is the output, and so the validation approach is different. And then it's also understanding again that it's starting as a nudge. It isn't replacing all of what we do today. So just an example, two examples to compare and contrast. Let's say a radiologist, and we're introducing AI for digital imaging. Again, that's threatening at first until they realize it takes away a lot of the mundane work, and a radiologist can focus on the more complicated imaging studies. And when it's a normal chest X-ray, they don't need to spend time on it as much, and also have confidence that that abnormalities are being picked up and flagged for them to focus on. With clinical prescriptive analytics, the same is true. Instead of, let's say, a case manager looking at every single patient as being discharged with COPD, now they're looking at a selected list of patients, and not needing to look at every patient creates that same sense of discomfort at first. It's doing something that it's out of my comfort zone, and doing something that I'm not used to or familiar with doing. That requires a shift in their thinking, and that flexibility and that culture change as well is all wrapped up in that. So I think some great points on that slide. I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. And thanks, Molly. I'll bounce off of you too. Anything, I want you to jump in here, but there's a lot of meat in this slide, so I'll touch on what I can. I'm keeping an eye on the time too. When we look at current state, there are a number of things that you can think about. A good starting place is a current state assessment, just to look at what your status is. Everything from where you are in an analytics maturity journey, and there are models out there to help with analytics maturity, looking at executive sponsorship for initiatives like this, and also who the key stakeholders are. Your executive sponsor should be the one who's going to drive the operational initiative at the highest level. So in the clinical arenas, it could be chief medical officer, chief nursing officer, chief quality officer. One of those roles, it has both the resources and the leadership and the vision to rally teams of people around it, and also to overcome some of the hurdles of introducing new things and change. If we look at, well, the other thing around current state, even looking at existing resources, both in IT and also more specifically in the analytics space. If you look at the architecture of an analytics program, that you have enterprise data warehouse, that may or may not be needed. If you're going to build your own solution, you need probably a data warehouse as a starting point. If you're leveraging, say, for example, a cloud-based solution, then in that case, an enterprise data warehouse might end up causing a lag time in data that could be extracted directly from the EHR through basic HL7 feeds and whatnot, and actually slow things down. So an EDW, when you look at current state, isn't a prerequisite, and at times it's okay, and at times it's a hindrance. If we look at AI opportunities, here's where the real, I mean, the appetite, our eyes are bigger than our stomachs in this space. And so we've come across organizations that said, oh, we're going to invest in AI, we're not sure where yet. That's almost a dangerous place for them to be. There are enough strategies and there are enough challenges and burning platforms. That should be the starting point that we pick for the AI opportunity. So we don't want to be a solution, and even within a health system, I don't want to drive a solution looking for a problem. What I need to start with is, where is there a challenge, a strategy, maybe something aligned with the 2019 strategic imperatives, where there is money being invested to solve those problems. That's the right place to start. So the AI opportunities, they're everywhere, but you have to be selective and strategic in how you pick them.
Yeah, John, that's interesting. If you don't mind if I chime in here, I think that's hopefully, I'm hoping organizations have learned from things that I've seen, challenges in the past. I'm going to talk about telemedicine again, just because everyone wants to create their own solution. I've seen within the organization, whether it's within NICU, within pediatrics, within dermatology or psychiatry, and for a while they've been going out getting different platforms. So I think it's so critical, as you mentioned, to have that strategy, not just as a specific disease area or area within the hospital, but as an overarching strategy for the organization, because you want to really avoid not knowing what the right and left hand are doing simultaneously. And so hopefully that's an area where we can learn from some of the mistakes we've made previously with other tech solutions.
Again, there's so much to say. This is like sampling at the buffet today, and a lot of fun, but it's really quick. When we look at that next arrow, diligence and feasibility, I really think this is underappreciated for the importance of it. When now we've got probably, let's say, a solution picked and also a use case, the diligence includes looking at both IT and analytics resources, I'll say, as a starting point. We want to understand what competing projects might be out there. Sometimes IT will say, sorry, there's no capacity due to an upgrade coming. Sometimes the decision that's made is unmade by another stakeholder group or by another executive. So another key question here is, who owns the decision? And it often can expose whether your organization has a good decision-making process or whether it is basically driven by the most important executive in the room. So then the other consideration here for due diligence is, what is the operational capacity to drive change? And sometimes IT's got the resources, analytics ready to go, but on the operational side, they're at their limit. And so you want to look at capacity to drive change, and the resources will be required as you're doing the diligence. When we get to the AI goals and business case, there You want to ensure upfront that you define the objectives for success, what your ROI targets are going to be. You want to, again, think ahead with the end in mind. Planning with the end in mind is a trite phrase, but it really applies here. And then lastly, the implementation roadmap. If you can do both clinical implementation track in parallel with the technical implementation, it can be very valuable to accelerate a timeline. Again, in the build, when we touched on build, the build process can be very long if it's done internally, and can take months or even more than a year. And then you're thinking about implementing it, and it becomes repetitively iterative, really painful at times. So there's an opportunity to do things in parallel instead of a waterfall approach. So we're going to talk through a specific opportunity and use case. Evergreen Health is a health system that's highly ranked in Washington, and they picked a very challenging use case to reduce the length of stay. And in their objective to reduce the length of stay, they had already implemented a fair number of processes, getting a working DRG going up front, planning on discharge early on, because we know discharge planning and delays in discharge are often a cause of prolonged length of stay. And all of that's good, and many organizations are doing that today, and yet it's still a challenge. The other challenge around length of stay is that you get the squeezing of the balloon effect, that if you shorten length of stay too much, then you increase your readmissions. And so this is a particularly complex opportunity. So how they use Jvion was to look at who are the patients that were going to be outliers from the average length of stay. And when we look at who the patients are that are going to be outliers and the reason why they're going to be outliers, then some patients bubble to the top in a different way that may not have been seen. And then secondly, the reasons why and the opportunities to change the trajectory begin to surface also. And that's the value where they experienced implementation of artificial intelligence and the way that it changed how they think about length of stay. 70% of the patients that are admitted hit the mean length of stay. So the goal is to hit the outliers, and who are those patients that either have clinical or socioeconomic factors driving their prolonged length of stay. I'm going to move to the next slide here, and I mentioned this already, but they fall into two buckets: avoidance of medical complications and preventing not the deterioration of a disease if a patient comes in with chronic heart failure or COPD, but the complications around that. It could be an infection, it could be pressure injuries. Those sorts of things are things that are both avoidable, preventable, and can be anticipated. So avoidance of complications is a major bucket of opportunity. And then the other bucket of opportunity, again, not just discharge planning equally on every patient, but identifying those particular factors that are going to prolong a particular patient's length of stay because of placement issues or social issues that were a little bit invisible. And all of the insights of the AI come together at Evergreen to unmask who those patients are. So I'm moving a little quicker here. We want to save time for questions, and so be sure to include, add your questions into the chat box if you have any. I want to just touch on this last slide here, some of the strategies to operationalize an AI strategy. And I'm not going to read the slide. I'm going to give you some additive talking points here. When you think about value for operation of the AI strategy, and you want to think about that up front, there should both be a patient benefit or patient-centric value, and then also an organizational value. And so defining those measures and how are we going to measure this is an important question to answer up front. Some of the design work that's done is mapped to those measures then. And when you look at operational and organizational value, that includes perhaps efficiencies in workflow or efficiencies in resources. It includes hitting quality measures. It includes hitting cost measures. So all of those things are potentially of value to the organization. And you want to look at how do we define value for the organization. As it's being operationalized also, impact to workflow is very important, and it's becoming paramount to integrate into the electronic health record, whatever that is in place today. If it's not integrated into the electronic health record, adoption is very much at risk, and adoption for these types of solutions is critical. So the way to go first and then to finish is to start with what I would call an initial deployment or first deployment. I'm going to avoid using the word pilot, but you start with some early adopters. You start with people who are more flexible to change, who are eager to try something new, and you show success there, and then you build on that. And so you have a plan in place, first deployment followed by a rollout that occurs in steps as you meet certain criteria. And I'm covering this at a high level, but you want stages, you want criteria, and to go from initial to final and complete rollout as quickly as possible. Greatest value to the organization is when it's diffused completely. And a couple of thoughts on communication, and then I'll pause, I'll turn this over. First of all, the earliest communications around success are anecdotes. We saw this patient and didn't appreciate what was going on with them, and we looked at them differently. We took these actions, and we're convinced that this was a different outcome for this patient. It's a patient story, and those anecdotes are the earliest wins. What follows is communication around successes around adoption. Who's using it, and aggregating that by groups, and as you're getting usage, and you can follow some process measures there around resources used or reduction in work effort around certain processes. Looking at those things is the next step when it comes to communication. And then lastly, organizational communication that really looks at outcomes. Are we moving the needle on the bottom line outcomes, which are quality, cost, and patient satisfaction, patient experience? So on that note, I'll finish. Molly, any additional thoughts?
No, I think that, obviously there's a lot to say, as you mentioned. We can only kind of cover the surface. I think one of the areas we should deep dive into at a later time is just some of the use cases. I think those will help everyone kind of really understand how it's being used and how it's real for different organizations. But I know that we have gotten a lot of questions, so I want to take a look at those questions. I don't know, John, if you've seen them.
Yeah, I think this is Anthony Chang, and I think we have quite a few interesting questions. I can highlight a few. Maybe we can just give short answers since we just have a few minutes left.
Yep.
Molly and John, what % of hospitals do you think are actually deploying AI solutions now?
Yeah, we've done some analysis, some market analysis on that, and purchasing up to this point, early 2019, is about 10% of the hospitals in the market. Another percentage of them are building something internally. We expect in the next 12 to 24 months that's going to double or triple. So we're in a time right now of rapid acceleration of AI and purchasing and investing in AI across the country.
Yeah. Molly, what do you think?
Yeah, I was going to say probably definitely on the lower end, between about 10 and 20%. I have worked with some organizations looking to build their own, but I think that, as I mentioned before, lessons learned from other digital health and innovations and cloud adoption technologies, looking to help them scale it across their organization or really look externally to work with organizations who do this full time. And to that end, I think that, within solving the very complex challenges within healthcare, looking at some of the most successful organizations that in that 10% have truly partnered, across organizations as across sectors, whether that's with a vendor, a partner like Jvion, and then a provider organization. Those are the best relationships and success stories.
Some of the data that I'm aware of is if you look at full-time data scientists in the healthcare organizations, well in the low single digits, I think. So it's still a long ways from, as you said, I think we need to have a portfolio of solutions, including education and people on site, but also deploying things that are ready to go. Another interesting question is, who do you think should be on the steering committee or the sort of the leadership position to drive the AI agenda for the healthcare organization?
Molly, you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm always biased towards clinicians and the people on the front line. So I think you're going to have the typical players in there, but I encourage organizations, whether you're a provider, whether you're a payer, whether you're life sciences, to think outside the box, not just within your own organization, within healthcare, but potentially looking at your consumer and patient base, as well as thinking about potentially even consulting or talking with folks outside of healthcare, for example, in retail or other industries where AI has been implemented, adopted, and successful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because at AI Med last year, it was, I think, a patient I had on stage resonated very well with, let's not forget about the patients in all of this. We're talking about the C-suite, the tech people, the doctors, but, we ought to absolutely include the patients in all of this too, because there are a lot of AI solutions that are meant really even driving solutions on the outside as well as inside a hospital. And as I always say, when AI starts working, we're actually not going to call it AI anymore. It's just going to be part of our routine.
Right, exactly.
How about how do we incorporate patient privacy concerns into the solutions? And I think that's a particularly good question for both of you, because you're on the implementation side. How do you reassure patients and clinicians that the patient security and confidentiality issue will be embedded within the solution?
Oh, wow. And you want an answer in 30 seconds or less, Anthony? Okay.
I know. How much time do you have?
Well, I have a short answer, but I wanted to hear what you guys are going to say.
I think it's. I'll give a very high-level answer. One, follow, of course, cybersecurity disciplines and privacy HIPAA requirements, but that's a given for PHI. The broader questions around personal data that don't fall under PHI, I think there needs to be an ethical understanding of the questions that we need to be asking, and then having a position on where we fall in answering those questions. For example, what do we purchase identity data that is so identifiable that we know details about patients that would make the patient uncomfortable? We really need to have the voice of the patient in helping to answer those questions and staying on the right side of that line, or we end up looking like, I don't want to name the social media vendors out there, but we end up looking like the social media.
Yeah, and I just want to tag on to that. From a perspective of Microsoft, obviously, if you've heard Satya Nadella talk, above any industry, I think, regardless if it's healthcare, financial services, I think trust, privacy, and security are incredibly important to our organization, and specifically to AI. We've been very involved with the really developing an ethics for AI framework, so that, to your point, John, thinking about personal information, et cetera, basically we've back in 2016 we created a list of proposed principles and guide for AI research and development. And I don't have enough time to talk about that. That could be another webinar.
I think I'm just remembering Alan Turing's wise words that we need machines for machines in terms of guiding machines. So I know there's discussion about having AI actually be embedded in cybersecurity, formats like blockchain, and you can't just do blockchain alone without some aspect that to be guided by artificial intelligence. I'm going to end with a very thought-provoking question, because I'm always for bringing humanities and non-AI issues into AI. And one question from one of our attendees is, what do you think is not going to be good for AI?
What will be not good for AI?
I promise you it would be thought-provoking, so. What do you think, John? John and Molly, what do you think in your travels and talking to so many healthcare providers and healthcare organizations? What do you see? What are you forecasting will just probably not work with an AI component?
Oh, well, what I was going to say from a strategy perspective, really just thinking about, not creating one-off solutions and how can you scale it, but that's not what you're asking. You're asking where it wouldn't fit. Well, I think ultimately, at the end of the day, healthcare is about people, and truly, technology has its place. But at the end of the day, you don't want to lose that human connection, and so that hands-on care, that face-to-face communication is so critical above and beyond any technology in healthcare. So that's not necessarily answering your question, but I think in light of the rapid evolution of technology in healthcare, I don't want us to lose sight of that human connection, human touch.
Yeah, I'll just add on. I was reminded last week that the Latin meaning for patient is the one who's suffering. And when I'm a patient, one day at some point probably, I don't want some machine being the one to give me empathy at that point. I want it to be a physician, a nurse, somebody who understands me. And so that empathy will never be replaced by AI. Things that can be automated should be, but there are limits and boundaries for it.
Great.
Well, I think those are great answers, but I think also, as I'm trying to fight the noise from the helicopter, which is technology, of our transport helicopter here, which is ironic. I think, when I'm always trying to bridge the clinicians with our data scientist colleagues, and I think sometimes when either side is predominant in a liaison relationship, when we see sort of asymmetry and then we get off target of what we're trying to achieve, which is great patient outcomes. So when the data scientists are thinking a solution is going to be very important for a problem and not get the clinicians involved and vice versa, I see solutions that are just not going to be adopted. And I think both sides can work even harder trying to come to the middle and do what I call design AI, which is what John said at the very beginning, which is coming up with solutions for the problems that actually do exist and are actually creating a burden for our clinicians. Any last minute thoughts, John, Molly? Why don't we give a tweet out under the theme today to our attendees before we sign off? What would you say is a good take-home message from your talk and your experience? Well, why don't we start with John?
And now is the time to invest in AI.
Okay, Molly?
240 characters or less?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just thinking of a good tweet. Yeah, I think the future is now. It's here. It's happening, and let's embrace it and bring the appropriate people to the table.
Very good. I agree. I resonate with what both of you are saying, which is, I think, get educated, get involved, And I think it's an amazing future for all of us. It's a once-in-a-generation kind of resource that we're blessed to have for medicine and healthcare. And I think we're very, very excited to see the next decade or two, probably the most exciting in the history of medicine. So with that, I'm going to thank both John and Molly for really giving us a thought-provoking session this morning, and thank all of you for participating, and wish you well for the rest of the week. Thank you, everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.